The crowd was already on his side. A vocal champion stood under the spotlight, confident, celebrated, untouchable. He'd built his reputation on one thing: no one could out-sing him live. So when he spotted a quiet man standing near the back, no entourage, no recognition, he smiled. "Let's make this interesting," he said, gesturing toward him. Laughter spread. People leaned forward. The man looked ordinary, too ordinary, perfect for a public embarrassment. "Come up," the singer said, handing him a microphone. "Show us what you got." The room expected a joke, a failure, another easy win. The quiet man stepped onto the stage. No hesitation, no nerves, just calm. He adjusted the mic, looked out at the crowd, and in that moment, a few people in the front row froze because they recognized him. The man the singer had just chosen at random was Elvis Presley, and the next note would end the challenge before it even began. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after he started singing turned that challenge into a moment no one in that room would ever forget. The venue that night was a mid-sized supper club somewhere between a concert hall and a lounge. The kind of place with low lighting and round tables pushed close together, where the distance between the performer and the audience felt deliberately small. About 300 people had packed inside. The energy was warm, celebratory, a little electric. They'd come to see someone they already loved, and he knew it. His name was known in performance circles. A singer with real ability, real training, and the particular confidence that comes from being the best person in every room he'd ever walked into. He'd done this before, the audience challenge, calling someone up, setting the trap, watching the crowd enjoy the discomfort. It was part of his act, not cruel exactly, but sharp. He understood the value of contrast. A nervous amateur beside a polished professional made the professional shine brighter. It was theater, and he was good at it. That night he was working the room the way he always did, moving through songs, trading lines with the crowd, building energy. He had the audience completely. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward, in the laughter that came right on cue, in the warmth directed toward the stage like something almost physical. Then he saw him, standing near the back wall, not quite in the crowd, not quite apart from it. A man alone, no drink in hand, watching the stage with a quiet kind of attention. No one around him seemed to notice him particularly. No buzz, no whispers. Just a man in ordinary clothes standing in an ordinary spot in the back of the room. The singer smiled. He'd found his volunteer. What happened next took maybe 30 seconds. A gesture toward the back, a little commentary to warm the crowd up, the easy laughter that followed. "Come on up, friend. Let's hear what you got." The crowd loved it already. This was the part they recognized, the familiar setup, the beginning of something they expected to enjoy at someone else's expense. The man at the back didn't hesitate, didn't look around, didn't shake his head or wave off the invitation. He just moved forward through the crowd with a stillness that some people noticed and most didn't. Someone near the front shifted in their chair. Someone else leaned sideways to look more closely. He climbed the 2 steps to the stage, took the microphone, stood there for a moment. 300 people waited for the joke to begin, and the next note would end the challenge before it even began. To understand what was about to happen, You have to understand where Elvis was in his life at that point. This wasn't Vegas. No sequin jumpsuit. No Colonel Parker hovering at the edge of the wings. No 20,000 people expecting a spectacle every time he opened his mouth. It was 1974. Elvis had slipped into this room the way a man slips into a quiet diner on a Tuesday, without announcement, without entourage, with just a couple of trusted friends and no plan to be recognized. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he wasn't performing either. There's a real difference between those two things. And in 1974, that difference mattered more to Elvis than most people knew. What was his life like then? Complicated. Beautiful in certain places. Painful in others. The Las Vegas residency had made him wealthier than he'd ever imagined. But it had also turned him into something closer to a machine than a man. 2 shows a night, same set list, same moves, the same enormous crowds cheering the same version of him they'd already decided they wanted to see. Charlie Hodge, who traveled with Elvis for years, once said the hardest part of those years wasn't the exhaustion. It was the loneliness of being surrounded by people who loved Elvis the icon and barely knew Elvis the person. So sometimes he'd go somewhere small, somewhere ordinary, somewhere the jumpsuit stayed in the hotel room and the man inside it could breathe for a few hours. That's what this night was. No agenda, no Colonel Parker on the phone, no schedule, just a man in a room with good acoustics and nowhere particular to be. The people he came in with knew who he was. They weren't going to say anything. That was understood without being said. And for the first 20 minutes or so, nobody else in that room noticed him either. He was quieter than you'd expect. Sat near the back, just watched. That quality in Elvis, the ability to be genuinely, almost invisibly still, was something people close to him always talked about. When he wasn't performing, he wasn't performing. No half version of the show running in the background, just a man, present, watching. Then the vocal champion made his move. Here's what's important to understand. The man with the microphone wasn't cruel. He was confident. There's a type of performer who treats every room like a stage and every stranger like a prop, not out of malice, but out of the particular blindness that comes with too much winning. He'd done this before. Picked someone who looked out of place and invited them up for the crowd's amusement. It always worked. The crowd always laughed. The stranger always fumbled. He always walked away looking larger than he arrived. He had no way of knowing. How could he? Elvis wasn't dressed like Elvis. He wasn't carrying himself like the king of rock and roll. The energy he was giving off was not the energy of a man who had sold 500 million records and stopped traffic in 4 countries. It was the energy of someone who genuinely wanted to be left alone with his thoughts and a decent song. But the front rows were figuring it out. You could see the recognition move through the people closest to the stage. Slow. Spreading. The kind that makes people go completely still. A woman put her hand over her mouth. The man beside her leaned over and said something. She nodded without taking her eyes off Elvis. Neither of them made a sound. Because here's the thing about a room slowly realizing it's in the presence of someone extraordinary. It doesn't get louder. It gets a different kind of quiet. The vocal champion hadn't noticed yet, still working the crowd, still wearing that confident smile. He handed the microphone over and gestured toward the stage as if presenting a gift. "Here's your moment, stranger." Elvis took the microphone. He looked out at the room and said nothing yet. And somewhere in those front rows, the stillness was spreading, moving back through the seats like something dropped in still water. People who hadn't recognized him 60 seconds ago were leaning toward the people beside them, whispering, going quiet. The laughter that had filled that room just moments earlier was draining away, replaced by something no one had a clean word for. Not quite shock, not quite reverence, something that lived right between the two. The man who had handed him the microphone was no longer smiling. Elvis looked out at the crowd for a moment, not nervously, just quietly, the way a man looks at a room he's already decided to be honest in. He didn't grip the microphone like a performer. He held it the way you hold something familiar. His shoulders dropped slightly, not from defeat, but from release, like a man who had just set something heavy down on the floor. There was no adjustment of posture, no scan of the crowd for approval, no showman's breath before the moment. Just stillness. Complete, unhurried stillness. The people nearest the stage would later say his face looked almost peaceful, like the challenge itself meant nothing to him, not because he was dismissive of it, but because he had already gone somewhere else entirely. The room had changed. 30 seconds earlier, it was loose, electric, buzzing with the kind of crowd energy that comes when people expect to watch someone get embarrassed. Now it was something different, something tighter. The laughter had drained out like water from a glass, and what replaced it was harder to name. Not quite silence, not quite anticipation, something in between. The kind of feeling you get when a room full of people all realize at the same moment that they may have misjudged what they were looking at. He chose "Love Me Tender." And that choice, quiet as it was, said everything. He didn't reach for a showstopper. He didn't pick something that would showcase range or power or technical ability. He didn't try to impress. "Love Me Tender" is a song that removes every hiding place. It is slow and sparse and built on almost nothing, which means there is nowhere for a voice to take cover. If you sing it carelessly, everyone hears it. If you sing it honestly, everyone feels it. There's no production to lean on, no arrangement to fill the space, no rhythm to carry you forward when the emotion gets heavy. It's just a voice and a melody and whatever truth the singer brings to it. Elvis knew that. He had always known that, and he chose it anyway. The first note arrived without announcement. No breath, no setup, no signal to the room that something was coming. One moment there was silence, and then there was his voice. And the transition between the two was so clean that people near the back of the room would later swear they felt it before they heard it. Something in the air changed pressure. That sounds impossible, but that's how they described it. That first note was not loud. It wasn't a declaration. It was low and open and completely unguarded, the kind of sound that bypasses the part of your brain that forms opinions and goes straight somewhere deeper. This wasn't the Vegas version of Elvis. That version was polished and powerful and enormous, built for arenas and television cameras and the mythology of the white jumpsuit. This wasn't the studio version either, carefully constructed, take by take, until every syllable sat exactly where it was supposed to. What came out of that microphone in that room was something rawer than either of those things. Something that sounded less like a performance and more like a man simply telling the truth out loud. His voice wavered slightly on the second word, not from weakness, from feeling. And instead of correcting it, he let it stay there. Let the room hear it. Let the imperfection sit exactly where it landed. A woman near the center of the room put her hand over her mouth. She didn't know she was going to do it. Her hands just moved. Two men in the back who had been leaning toward each other, talking and laughing, maybe 30 seconds before, were now completely still, facing the stage with expressions that didn't quite have a name yet. A teenager standing near the side wall had been holding a drink. At some point, she placed it down on a table beside her without looking at it, without meaning to, drawn forward by something she couldn't explain. The vocal champion, who had handed Elvis that microphone with a grin, was standing approximately 8 feet away. He was not grinning anymore. He was watching. His arms had dropped to his sides. He looked for the first time all evening like a man who understood the difference between confidence and capability. He had mistaken one for the other. He was learning the distinction in real time. The song continued, unhurried, filling every corner of the room the way heat fills a cold space, slowly, completely, until there was no part of the room it hadn't reached. People who had come to laugh had stopped laughing several seconds ago and hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened. Nobody laughed. There's a difference between a great singer and a voice that makes you forget where you are. And most people in that room learn that difference in real time. It started small, the way these things always do. A note hanging in the air just a half-second longer than expected. A phrase that bent slightly, naturally, the way a branch bends in wind rather than breaking. And people who had been leaning toward each other, whispering, maybe already composing the story they'd tell tomorrow, went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience being patient. Something else. The kind of quiet that happens when your body decides to pay attention before your mind catches up. The vocal champion was still standing near the edge of the stage. His microphone was at his side. He wasn't sure what to do with his hands. A few seconds earlier, he'd been the center of everything in that room. Every eye, every laugh, every ounce of energy had belonged to him. Now he was standing on the same stage, and he might as well have been furniture. He watched Elvis sing the way you watch something you don't fully understand yet. Not with envy, not yet. Just with a kind of stunned attention. What was happening wasn't a performance. That's the thing you have to understand about Elvis when the machinery fell away. No lights engineered to flatter him. No crowd of 20,000 creating their own momentum, carrying him forward on pure noise. This was a small room. People close enough to see his face clearly. And his face wasn't performing. It was just open. Whatever the song meant to him was right there on the surface, visible to anyone who looked. That's what made it almost unfair. Most singers, even good ones, build a small wall between themselves and what they're singing. It protects them, keeps the performance controlled, professional, repeatable, 8 shows a week. Elvis, when he chose not to build that wall, when he let the song land where it actually lived inside him, had no such protection, and neither did anyone listening. There was a woman near the middle of the room who had come specifically because she thought watching someone get embarrassed would be entertaining. She later told people she started crying without knowing why. Not because she was sad, more like something moved through her before she had the chance to decide whether to let it. That's what real singing does. It doesn't ask permission. A few people toward the back were still half smiling, still half expecting the joke to reassert itself. But the smiles faded unevenly, one by one, as the song moved through its second verse, and it became clear this wasn't stopping. This wasn't winding toward a punchline. This was just a man singing something true, and the room had no defense against it. The vocal champion shifted his weight. He looked out at the audience, maybe searching for someone who was still on his side, still watching him. Nobody was. Every face had turned. Not away from him exactly, but toward something that had become more important than whatever contest he'd started 20 minutes ago. He'd spent years building a crowd. He understood how attention worked, how you earned it, how you kept it. What he was watching now didn't follow any of those rules. Elvis wasn't earning the room. He was just singing. And the room was simply going to him the way water goes downhill. There's something Charlie Hodge said years later about watching Elvis in moments like this. He said it felt sacred, and he meant that literally, not as a figure of speech. He meant there were times when Elvis opened his mouth and something larger than entertainment entered the room. Whether you believed in that kind of thing or not, you felt it. You couldn't really argue with it while it was happening. By the final section of the song, the room had transformed into something none of those people had paid to experience. They'd come for a show, a competition, something light and fun and slightly mean in the way fun can sometimes be. Instead, they were standing in the middle of something they'd be describing to their friends for years, trying to explain what it felt like, probably failing. Because the honest answer was that it felt like the truth. And the truth, coming through a voice like that, in a room that small, at close range, was more than most people were prepared to receive on a random night without warning. The vocal champion hadn't moved. He was still on stage, still holding his microphone at his side. But something about how he was standing had changed. His shoulders were different. His chin was lower. He wasn't calculating anymore. He was just listening, the same as everyone else because there was nothing else to do. When the last note finally faded, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled. The man who had started all of this was still standing on the same stage. But something about the geometry of the room had shifted entirely. A minute ago, he was the center of it. The axis everything turned around. Now he was off to the side, still holding his microphone, still technically part of the same room, and yet somehow separate from what had just happened. The crowd wasn't looking at him. They weren't looking away from him in cruelty, the way people sometimes do after a humiliation. It was almost more disorienting than that. They had simply moved on. Not to the next thing, to something bigger than the thing he thought he was offering them. He stood there. That was the first thing people noticed afterward. He didn't walk off. He didn't busy himself adjusting something. He just stood and took it in the way you have to when there's nothing else left to do. What does it feel like to hand someone a microphone and realize about 30 seconds too late that you've made a mistake you can't undo? And not a mistake in the sense of something shameful, though the embarrassment was real and nobody in that room was pretending otherwise. A mistake in the sense of a miscalculation so total that it rearranges your understanding of how good at something you actually are. He had spent years building a reputation around his voice, around the certainty that in a live room, head-to-head, he could outshine anyone. That confidence wasn't hollow. He was good, maybe genuinely great by most measures. The crowd that night would have told you so 30 minutes earlier, and they wouldn't been lying. But there's a thing that happens when you're very good at something and you encounter someone who operates on a completely different level. It doesn't feel competitive. It just feels like information. The crowd sensed his stillness. A few people near the front glanced over at him, not unkindly. There was something almost respectful in the way the room held space for what he was going through. Nobody jeered. Nobody called out. The laughter that had been so easy earlier was completely gone now, replaced by something more complicated. These were people who had come expecting to watch someone get embarrassed, and they had watched something get embarrassed, just not who they expected. He brought the microphone up, set it back down. His eyes moved toward Elvis, who was standing quietly at the center of the stage, not triumphant, not performing triumph, just present. That was the thing about it. Elvis wasn't doing anything with the moment. He wasn't taking a bow. He was just there, the way he had been from the beginning, and that stillness somehow made everything more complete. The vocal champion cleared his throat, and then he did something that people in that room would remember more clearly than almost anything else that happened that night. He started clapping, slowly, deliberately, the way you clap when your hands feel a little heavy and you're clapping anyway, because it's the honest thing to do, not performing graciousness. Actually arriving at it in real time, which is harder and rarer and looks different from the outside. Someone near the back joined him. Then several more. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, relieved kind. It carried something genuine in it, partly for Elvis, and partly, if you were watching closely, for the man standing off to the side who had just chosen decency when other options were available to him. He walked over to Elvis. Not quickly, not dramatically. He walked the way you walk when you've accepted something. His face was open in a way it hadn't been when the evening started. He said something. The accounts vary on exactly what, and it doesn't really matter. And Elvis nodded in that unhurried way he had, the way that never seemed to require a performance around it. A few people nearby heard it, most didn't. He handed Elvis the microphone back, and the crowd understood that the contest was over. After Elvis left the stage, people stood around for a while, the way they do, after something they don't quite have words for yet. Nobody rushed for the exit. Nobody checked their phone. They just stood there, talking quietly, the way a congregation lingers after a service that hits somewhere deep and unplanned. A few people near the front were still visibly shaken. One woman described it later as feeling like the air had changed consistency, like the room was somehow heavier and lighter at the same time. That's not an easy thing to explain to someone who wasn't there. But the people who were there didn't need it. Explained. Elvis didn't disappear immediately. That was the thing. There was no security sweep, no handler pulling him toward a side exit. He moved through the room the way he'd arrived in it, quietly, without ceremony, stopping when someone spoke to him. A man near the bar said something to him and Elvis laughed, a real laugh, not the stage kind. Someone asked if he'd done that before, and Elvis just said, "Done what?" Which was either the most humble thing you could say in that moment or the most Elvis thing. Probably both. The vocal champion found him near the back of the room maybe 20 minutes after the performance. Whatever that conversation was, the people standing close enough to see it said Elvis did most of the listening. That was another thing people remembered. He wasn't the one talking. He was leaning slightly forward, arms loose at his sides, just taking it in. The other man spoke for a while. At some point, Elvis put a hand on his shoulder, said something that made the guy nod slowly, and then they shook hands. Not the grip of two men settling a score. More like two people who'd accidentally ended up somewhere honest together and were acknowledging it. What Elvis actually said in that moment, nobody knows for certain. But the witnesses who were in that room carried the story carefully, the way you carry something fragile. They told it in specific terms. The blue jacket he was wearing, the way the light caught the bar mirror, how quiet it got right before his voice came in. Details like that don't survive years of retelling unless something burned them in. This wasn't a story people repeated because it was dramatic. They repeated it because it felt true in a way that most things don't. And here's what the story really says about him. Elvis could have made that moment into something. He had every tool to do it. The crowd was already reorienting toward him, already ready to love him loudly if he'd given them the signal. He could have leaned into the legend, could have turned it into a performance of graciousness, the kind that photographs well and gets quoted. He didn't do any of that. He sang because someone handed him a microphone and he knew how. Then he walked off and talked to people like a man who had nothing to prove. Because in that room, he hadn't been trying to prove anything. That instinct, to sing honestly instead of strategically, was maybe the most revealing thing about who he actually was beneath all the machinery. The jumpsuits and the arena lights and the colonel's careful management had built something enormous around him. But in a room like that one, with none of that scaffolding present, what came through was simpler. Just a man who loved to sing, who couldn't really do it any other way except honestly, and who seemed genuinely unbothered by the effect it had on people. Not unaware, just unbothered, like the response was their business, and the singing was his. The witnesses aged. The room itself changed hands, got renovated, became something else. But the story kept circulating in the way that real stories do, not through official channels, not because anyone promoted it, but because the people who saw it couldn't quite let it go. They'd mention it at dinner. Bring it up when someone talked about great voices. Say, "I was in a room once," and then have to stop and figure out how to describe what came next. The man who had issued the challenge that night would later say it was the best thing that ever happened to him. And there was no reason to doubt. He meant it. Elvis Presley had been famous for so long that people sometimes forgot he had been a singer long before he was a legend. Before the jumpsuits, before Las Vegas, before Colonel Parker turned him into a brand that could be packaged and sold and marketed to every corner of the world, there was just a kid from Tupelo who sang because it was the only language that felt true. That never left him. People who knew Elvis in private settings, the ones who saw him when the machinery was turned off and the cameras were gone, they all said the same thing. The voice didn't change. It didn't get smaller or more careful or more calculated. If anything, it got more honest. Charlie Hodge remembered sitting in the Graceland living room late at night, just the two of them, and Elvis would start singing something low and quiet, not performing, just singing the way people breathe. And Charlie said it hit him the same way it hit 20,000 people in an arena. Maybe harder, because there was nothing between you and it. No lights, no crowd, and no spectacle, just the thing itself. That's what that room discovered. The challenge had been designed around the idea that performance requires a stage. That a singer, stripped of his setting, stripped of his audience and his reputation, becomes ordinary. What nobody accounted for was that Elvis had never needed any of that. His voice wasn't a product of circumstance. It was something he carried in his chest every day, sacred to him the way gospel had always been sacred, the way his mother's hymns in that small Tupelo church had been sacred. He didn't treat singing as entertainment. He treated it as truth-telling. And truth-telling doesn't require a spotlight. People who heard him sing at hospital bedsides, in dressing rooms, in hotel lobbies, when he didn't know anyone was listening, they used the same word every time. Sacred. Not impressive, not technically brilliant, though both of those things were true. Sacred. Like something larger than the man was moving through him when he opened his mouth. What happened in that room when the vocal champion handed over the microphone expecting a fumbling stranger and got Elvis Presley instead wasn't really about the surprise. The surprise wore off in seconds. What stayed with people was what came after. The sound. The complete, undefended honesty of it. A voice that had nothing to prove and everything to give. That was always who he was beneath the legend. Not the king, not the icon, not the performer manufactured for arenas and movie screens. Just a man who believed, down somewhere deep and immovable, that singing was the most honest thing a human being could do. He wasn't trying to win anything that night, and that, more than the voice itself, was probably why he did.